start with bugle beads. Normally, bugle beads are put on one after another flat to the surface, but you can do them slightly different ways. For this application, we're going to take just a small stitch from our beginning stitch, and instead of taking one bugle bead, we're going to take two. It's a little tricky, but you can get used to it, and you pull that stitch through. And now you have two bugle beads standing right next to each other on their ends. And I generally will then take another small side stitch and then once again a little bit longer stitch to the side to pick up two beads. From this direction it's just a little fidgety because you have to kind of fold the beads up to be able to get to the thread to catch it. But after a while, you get used to being able to do it, and then the two beads stay next to each other. A little locking stitch, and that gives a little space between the next two standing beads. Again, you can see how I have to fold the beads and carefully catch the thread, bring it up through, and make a little holding stitch just to secure those while you're getting the others. The stitch that you're making to the side is basically equal to the thickness of the two beads. You want to make sure that you give them enough space to stand up, but not so much that they're going to have space in between them. This works really well with long bugle beads. Sometimes the really, really long ones require a little circle of something around them to help hold them up. That could be slightly shorter bugle beads, and it makes for really, really interesting center sections of flower. See, again, from this direction, it's just very tricky to catch that thread without getting the thread or the hook caught in other beads. I would just take a little side stitch. Now we're going to start modifying this a little bit. Instead of taking a tiny, tiny stitch, we're going to take one that's a little bit longer, and it begins to open the bugle beads up a little bit, and then we're gradually going to expand the length of that stitch, still taking a little lock stitch at the end and then going on to the next stitch of beads, but we're still taking two bugle beads with each of them. And as at this point we're measuring one bead and taking two. That's a pretty good way to get a very even structure of beads on the front. Measure one, take two. But as you see, we gradually moved up to that measure one, take two, and now you can also then go past it by going 1.5 and take two, and it starts to let the height drop. Then maybe 1 3/4, which I think this is what this one is coming up. There's 1 3/4 or thereabouts, but it's a little too far. It's too much of a jump from the last one, so I'm going to shorten it ever so slightly. Again, another little locking stitch, and then 1 almost to 1 3/4, or probably more like 7/8. Now we're pretty close to being flat, so I can go right back to the original idea of 1 bead per stitch, and then now the beads are lying flat. So what we've accomplished here is starting with the beads standing on their edges, on their ends, upright, and then gradually separating them until they actually go from standing together to high peaks to lower peaks, back down to the actual 1 stitch per bead. Now let's see what it looks like on the other side. You can see here is where the single bead is lying against the fabric. Now they're starting to have some height, and they're getting a little bit taller with each stitch because the stitch is shorter, forcing them to raise up a little bit higher. These last couple here are the height that you get for take two in 1 stitch, and then eventually they get closer and closer until they are standing right next to each other. This is a great way to create a foundation for weaving ribbons or other threads through that kind of a structure. Now, another way you can work with bugle beads is to stitch them on in parallel rows. Instead of one continuous row, you sit them side by side. So you take the stitch, and then you pull that stitch back, You have to bring that thread around to the side, and you'll see why later. Take another stitch there, and then bring that stitch up to the top of the bead, setting it right next to the first one. You pull that stitch back, and you just continue that back and forth, keeping the beads usually on an even line. I would generally have a baseline to follow. But you can also then begin to make them drop down in arcs and circles and all kinds of shapes just by adjusting the continuing stitch a little bit lower. Now this is pulling a little harder because I took 2 stitches there rather than just one loose one. And I probably would try to keep doing just one stitch off to the side and down. Again, I'm not following a line here, I'm just making it up as I go, but if you had a line to follow, you would just bring the hook down to that next point on the line and make and grab your bead and make your stitch. But it's all the same. It's a stitch up to the top of the bead, then pull the thread back, and you can create some wonderful patterns across a design with parallel bugle beads. That one was too straight down and not enough to the side because the bead wouldn't sit flatly. That's the other thing you have to watch out for. So then we just finish it off like normal, and let's see how this looks. So on the other side, here we see we've got one thread that didn't get wrapped around and crossed over the bead. Sometimes that happens. If it does, you just take the back of your hook and push it right over the bead, and it'll hide itself underneath. But here's how the beads look, right next to each other, and they can go down in shapes and curves, up and down in peaks and valleys, just by using that kind of a technique.